The Unseen Storm, Nigeria's Years of Suffering. We begin with the quiet tragedy of people whose names the world has mostly ignored. This story is not about numbers. It is about humanity and the unseen truth, the scenes of loss and desperate survival that most cameras missed. Stay with us, because this isn't just a crisis happening somewhere else. It's a stark look at the fragility of safety for us all. You will meet the man or woman who carried the searing memory of a fire from the very house that should have sheltered them. And we will trace the sudden, terrifying silence where entire communities once stood, villages that simply vanished overnight. Listen closely for the chilling pattern, the invisible thread that ties these isolated tragedies together. This is the human heart of the story. What drove ordinary people to make impossible, life-altering choices just to survive? Hold your breath for the moment we finally pull back the curtain on the hidden network that enabled this injustice. We will show you the painful proof that vital warnings were dismissed and answers were ignored. Don't look away now. You will miss the instant this overwhelming crisis finally becomes personal and profoundly real. Stay with us until the very end. Your attention, focused on their story, is the only true honor we can give to the memory of every victim. The night offered no mercy, no strange wind, and no distant sound to warn of the terror that was about to unfold. On an ordinary night, thousands of families across Nigeria went to sleep, only to wake into a fear that would shatter their lives forever. The violence did not begin with a roar. It began with the quiet shift of footsteps on dry soil, with sinister whispers in the dark, and then with gunfire that raced from one village to another like a rushing storm. This is the story of communities swallowed by a darkness that grew into one of the most painful cycles of suffering in modern Nigeria. Stay with this story. Your presence honors the victims whose voices were taken. This account exposes a devastating pattern of destruction, homes obliterated, families torn apart, and entire towns vanishing. The sheer scale of the loss is staggering. Almost 56,000 people lost their lives in just 4 years. The numbers are clear, but the human pain behind those numbers is a deeper, harder truth. Many died in the very villages where they were born. Many died without a moment's warning. Many died while begging for mercy that never came. Nigeria is a nation of rich cultures and strong communities. It is also a nation of deep divisions that have been exploited to fuel these attacks. Ethnic tension, religious conflict, crushing pressure over land, extremist groups, and sprawling militia networks all collided, pushing ordinary people into the line of fire. From October 2019 through September 2023, the data shows a trail of targeted killings revealing 11,000 incidents of extreme violence across the country. Each incident is an individual tragedy. Each number hides a name. Every statistic begins with a human story. You will understand why these killings happened. You will understand the chilling calculus behind how victims were chosen. You will hear how families fought to survive. You will hear how the violence grew even as the world stayed silent. This will be hard to listen to. It should be hard. These lives mattered. Do not look away from this. Someone once lived this very moment. The most frightening element of these attacks was their cold, predictable patterns. Early threats were dismissed as local disputes. Early warnings were ignored. Many believed the tension would simply cool, that the conflict would fade. Instead, the opposite happened. Armed groups grew stronger, their operations became more coordinated, and their brutality increased exponentially. Reports gathered from local sources, religious bodies, security agencies, and independent monitors paint a disturbing reality. Out of the 55,910 deaths, 30,880 were innocent civilians. They were farmers trying to feed their families, traders traveling to market, and children simply playing. They had no part in any conflict. They died because they were present. They died because they were seen as representatives of a religion or an ethnicity. Victims came from Christian, Muslim, and traditional African belief systems. Yet one truth stands out in the sheer volume of numbers. Most of the civilian victims were Christian. At least 16,769 Christians were killed within that 4-year period. This number is not an estimate. It is a record of people who lived in fear long before they were attacked. In the same period, 6,235 Muslims were also killed. Many lived in the same regions, suffered at the hands of the same militia groups, and were trapped in the same cycles of revenge. Their stories, too, matter profoundly. The violence targeted both sides of the religious divide, but the distribution reveals that Christian communities in several regions faced a consistent, devastating threat from groups operating with increasing boldness. You will hear about those patterns. You will hear about the villages that vanished. You will hear about victims who ran toward safety but never reached it. In many attacks, the extremists made their intentions horrifyingly clear. Survivors recount groups arriving in the dead of night, gunfire ripping through homes that had been marked earlier in the day. They describe the separation of villagers by religion, followed by executions carried out without hesitation. Children cried for their parents, mothers screamed, fathers fought with whatever tools they could find. Most fell within minutes. Nigeria's Middle Belt became a slaughterhouse during this period. States like Kaduna, Plateau, Benue, Nasarawa, Niger, and Taraba witnessed cycles of violence that grew worse each year. Attacks struck villages while residents were sleeping. Survivors often returned to find only ashes where their houses once stood. Attackers moved through, leaving only silence mixed with unbearable grief. Villagers describe how escape routes were blocked, how homes were set ablaze, trapping families inside to burn. Those forced out by the smoke faced gunmen waiting for them. The few who survived did so by hiding in bushes, the sound of bullets buzzing near their heads. Many lost their entire families before the dawn broke. Communities that once held gatherings, farming groups, and prayer meetings now hold only memories of running barefoot through the night. Many fled to overcrowded camps or trusted strangers in faraway cities, never to return home.
These attacks were not random. They often followed intelligence failures and ignored reports. Local leaders warned that armed men had been sighted days earlier, suspicious movement on nearby hills, shadows in the forests. In too many cases, security forces arrived hours late. In some, they never arrived at all. Witnesses consistently said the attackers moved with weapons far stronger than those carried by local security units, operating with the confidence of those who know resistance will be weak. In rare, desperate moments, villagers tried to defend themselves. They formed vigilante groups armed with sticks, bows, old shotguns, or farming tools, standing between their families and the onslaught. Many died in those final brave stands. Abductions also surged. Over 21,000 people were kidnapped in 4 years. Travelers were pulled off highways. Students were snatched from classrooms. Worshippers were taken from churches. Some victims were found months later. Some were never found at all. Some families paid ransoms that left them bankrupt. Some received their loved ones back in horrific physical and psychological conditions. Some received only bodies. The killings often came with a chilling message left behind: burned scriptures, written threats, the deliberate destruction of anything linked to the targeted community. These actions showed clear intent, clear targeting, and clear motive. Many of the Christian victims lived in farming areas where land conflict was a factor, yet they were caught between extremist ideology and territorial control. Some attackers claimed revenge for older disputes, some claimed a need for land. But whatever the claimed reason, ordinary people paid the highest price. Muslim victims also faced targeted killings, some in reprisal attacks, others in raids by groups with no allegiance to any religion, simply trapped in a territory controlled by armed gangs. Their losses added to the national grief. Even the Nigerian armed forces were devastated. Over 2,000 military personnel died responding to ambushes and counter-operations. Their deaths reveal the brutal difficulty of the situation, fighting extremist groups and unidentified militias whose enemy often changed shape, often while forces lacked information, equipment, or support. Every number has a story. Every victim had a life. Every village had its traditions. Many of those traditions now live only in memory. Imagine the pressure placed on the families that survived. Parents hid their children every night. Some slept in the bushes. Some took turns staying awake, their eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for footsteps that might signal danger. When dawn finally came, the relief was uncertain, as attackers often returned days later. There were villages that lost half their population in a single attack. There were families that lost every adult. There were children who walked through the remains of their homes, searching for anything that reminded them of their parents. A shoe, a scorched toy, a small item that their young minds could grasp. Human rights walkers who visited the affected areas described scenes that changed their lives. They met survivors who spoke without emotion because they had cried all their tears. They met men who had walked miles with wounded relatives on their backs. They met mothers who searched heaps of debris for missing children. Attackers used surprise as a weapon. They studied village routines, striking early in the morning, during prayer times, or at night, moments when defenses were lowest. Churches became common targets. Congregations gathered for Sunday service only to be surrounded within minutes. Survivors describe attackers setting fire to doors, shooting anyone who tried to escape. Pastors and church leaders became primary victims, symbols of spiritual anchors that the attackers wanted to remove. In other regions, mosques were attacked by opposing groups in retaliation for earlier killings, trapping worshippers inside and adding new layers of tension to communities that once lived side by side. By the end of 2023, many Nigerians lived in a state of constant alertness. They listened for strange movements outside their windows. They moved with caution on rural roads. They prepared escape plans even when attending a wedding or a funeral. Life lost its rhythm. Displacement became normal. Families gathered what little they could carry and moved to safer states, walking for hours through forests and rivers. Many never recovered financially. Many developed trauma that stayed with them long after the immediate danger had passed. The cycle continued because attackers often felt untouchable. Few arrests, few prosecutions, few long-term interventions. Communities felt abandoned. The lack of accountability fueled an anger that later fueled more violence. When you hear about thousands of deaths, the mind tries to protect itself, grouping the pain into one large, impersonal idea. It hides the details, it hides the faces, it hides the screams. But every single attack carried its own story. Every event happened in a real place, to real people. The fear was personal. The loss was personal. The silence that followed was heavy. To understand the growth of these attacks, you must look at the machinery behind the fear. The armed groups that moved across forests and rural paths. Some followed extremist ideology, some served local power holders, some acted as independent militias. Their identities were not always clear, but their impact was devastating. One pattern was the rise of mobile armed bands. They used their intimate knowledge of rivers, hills, and footpaths to build hideouts in dense vegetation, avoiding major checkpoints. They watched villages for days before striking, studying routines, when people went to the market, when
Extremist factions, grown out of larger terror movements, carried immense firepower. They targeted Christian villages, often because they viewed them as resistance to their agenda. But they also attacked Muslim communities that refused to support them. They trained fighters in remote areas, teaching them to handle rifles, move fast on motorcycles, and disappear before patrols could arrive. They gained strength as local security structures weakened. These extremist groups often formed cold alliances with criminal gangs, which expanded their reach, gave them access to weapons markets, and provided informants inside towns. This connection helped them strike with greater precision, knowing exactly where victims would run and blocking the escape paths. Conflict between herding groups and farming communities was another brutal driver. Misunderstandings over grazing routes grew into clashes, and armed groups exploited these disputes, turning them into large-scale violence. They entered farmlands during harvest, destroying crops, killing livestock, and burning grain stores, forcing farmers into impossible poverty. The networks behind the violence used fear as a core strategy. They wanted to break all community resistance, force people to abandon their land, and establish control. One way they did this was through the targeted killings of community leaders, pastors, chiefs, imams, and respected elders. These were the people who protected unity and encouraged calm. Attackers removed them first, knowing their absence would sow confusion and create openings for larger raids. The use of mass abduction was another powerful tool. Armed groups knew abduction created long-lasting panic, destroyed trust, and forced families to make impossible choices. The abduction of students was especially potent, causing parents to stop sending their children to school, collapsing education, and stealing the community's future. Over 21,000 abductions reflect a network built on fear and profit. The crisis escalated due to weak security responses. Security units covered vast territories with limited personnel. Attackers knew this, striking multiple places at once, moving at night, and attacking when patrols were far away. Residents reported suspicious activity days before an attack and waited for intervention that often never came, or arrived hours after the attackers had gone. This failure to investigate early attacks emboldened the perpetrators. When they walked free, the violence escalated, and when victims saw no justice, they lost all faith in protection. The influx of high-powered weapons smuggled across borders and from illegal markets turned small land disputes into mass killings. Attackers moved with rifles and ammunition belts that far exceeded what villagers could defend against. In some regions, attackers entered villages and issued chilling warnings, demands for payment, threats of return. These warnings spread like wildfire through neighboring towns. People fled before the next attack, and once a village was abandoned, the attackers claimed the land. Despite all this, ordinary Nigerians fought hard to survive. Women carried their children to safer towns. Men escorted families across long distances. Teenagers volunteered to help the displaced. Teachers tried to hold classes in damaged buildings. Pastors prayed with grieving families. Imams comforted survivors. Communities showed a profound strength, a refusal to completely break even when surrounded by danger. But the networks behind the violence remained. They hid in the forests. They controlled the rural paths. They prepared for the next attack. Their presence shaped daily life across multiple states. Now you understand the machinery behind the killings. These networks built a system that produced fear, destruction, and loss. This final part brings you to the aftermath. It shows what happened after the attackers left. It shows the wounds that remain open. It shows the strength of survivors who live with memories they cannot erase. Stay with their stories. You owe them your attention. When an attack ends, the silence that follows is unnatural. Villages that once carried the noise of life, markets, children, livestock, become quiet, and this quietness holds the grief. Survivors step out of hiding, walking cautiously through burned houses, calling out for relatives. Some find answers. Some find what they feared. Some find nothing at all. Bodies lie on the ground. Families gather around their loved ones, kneeling in shock, crying until their voices fail, or sitting in a silence that means sorrow has become too heavy to lift. These scenes repeated across states, across communities, across 4 years of recorded violence. After each attack, survivors face life-altering decisions. Some bury their dead near their homes. Some must leave the bodies where they fell because they must flee quickly. The journey is agonizing. Children with dust on their faces, mothers carrying infants, the elderly leaning on sticks, walking for hours to reach a safer town. Displacement camps become the new, brutal reality for thousands. They lack space and resources. Families sleep on thin mats, sharing small rooms. They rely on donated food. At night, some camps hear the distant echo of gunfire, a sound that keeps survivors awake, proving that trauma follows them even into places meant for safety. Inside these camps, childhood is stolen. Children remember the night they ran, the faces that never returned. They hold the memories inside, trauma as an unspoken language. Adults can't farm or trade. Pastors and imams try to hold small gatherings, but fear keeps many worshipers away. The wounds are not just physical, they are social. When one group suffers, the other group fears revenge. The wounds spread. Some survivors who returned to their villages months later found a frozen scene of destruction. Houses in ruins, walls burned, wells contaminated, farmland overtaken by weeds. They searched for small items that reminded them of their past: a cooking pot, a piece of cloth, a school notebook, treasures in the middle of unbearable loss. The emotional cost is immeasurable. Survivors often relive the attack, the sound of the gunfire, the smell of the smoke, the feeling of running barefoot on sharp stones. These memories wake them at night. They cannot sleep. They cry in silence. Many never receive the counseling they desperately need. As the death toll climbed, the need for justice grew stronger. Families wanted answers, accountability, and recognition of their pain. Yet, children orphaned by the violence face a future without parents, taken in by relatives or entering orphanages. Their childhoods ended the night the violence struck. The families of the abducted wait in endless agony, their lives revolving around hope. When victims returned, families cried with relief. When they did not return, families cried with despair. Some relatives are still waiting. The struggle to rebuild continues. Some villages have started new farms, constructed new houses, and reopened schools. But fear stays close. People listen for sounds at night. They watch the roads carefully. Even when peace returns to some areas, survivors carry memories that shape every decision. Nigeria remains a country of strong, resilient people. Communities refuse to disappear. They rebuilt from the ground. They supported each other. Their courage speaks louder than the violence. But this crisis left warnings that the world must hear. Without justice, cycles of violence continue. Without accountability, attackers grow stronger. Without support for victims, trauma spreads through generations. The numbers in this report are not distant statistics. They reflect lives lived in fear and lives taken in suffering. The 4-year period recorded 55,910 deaths. Out of these, 30,880 were civilians. Among the civilians, at least 16,769 were Christian. At least 6,235 were Muslim. Thousands more carried unknown identities because chaos hides the details. These numbers define a crisis that must never be ignored. Nigeria's future depends on healing. Healing requires truth. Healing requires justice. Healing requires unity. Healing requires protection for vulnerable communities. Survivors deserve safety. Children deserve stability. Families deserve peace. This story should push the world to act. It should push leaders to protect their people. It should push communities to seek peace. It should push listeners to understand the danger of silence. Violence grows when the world looks away. Lives depend on what happens next. You have walked through the pain. You have seen the aftermath. You have heard the voices behind the numbers. This story carried you into the heart of a crisis that took thousands of lives. Their stories must not fade. Their memories must remain. Stay aware of global suffering. Value human life above all else. Support those who lost everything. Listen intently to the voices that often go unheard. Honor every victim by refusing silence. Peace begins with awareness. Thank you for watching. Your support helps this channel reach more people with stories that need attention. If you want to follow more true crime breakdowns, like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe, and follow the channel for future uploads.